Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everyone, for joining in today. So I'll just do a very quick intro of myself and Rekha. So I am Gayatri. Usually people call me Guy. They find it easier. And I've been part of Maarga Systems right from inception. And I right now head technology. I started off with Lotus Notes, but now I kind of have diversified into multiple technology areas and things like that. And Rekha is our SME for migration, and she comes with a long list of experience on both the Lotus as well as the SharePoint platform. So that's just us, and we're ready to get started. Okay, so without so much further ado, let's look at what we are going to cover today. So we said we will start off with understanding, taking a little bit of a look at workflows and workflow engines, especially with respect to SharePoint Online. Then look at a methodology for the entire migration program. We look at a specific workflow application that we migrate using a particular tool called Nintex. The workflow tool called Nintex, and then also discuss a little bit of best practices and challenges that you face when you are bringing over a notes application into SharePoint Online. A vast product, we'll try to do justice to this entire area. So before we start off, today we are discussing primarily about SharePoint Online, right? And in this context, SharePoint is a very vast collaboration platform. Along with Office 365, it's typically used in multiple purposes within an organization. We look at intranet portals. You can look at a very collaborative team site that allows departments and teams to work very closely together. You can use it as a complete document management and a content management system. You could build workflow applications on top of this, and also, project sites and project management, task management kind of systems. But today, there is a very specific reason we are focusing on the workflow applications, right? That's what we're going to focus on. One of the key things here before we jump in is we know that you can have applications in your Lotus Notes portfolio that kind of spread across these areas. They spread across, team sites. You could have project task type monitoring applications and things like that. But today's focus specifically is on workflow applications, and we'll discuss why in a little while. So Scott, before we start off on those aspects, can you just run the first poll?
Okay, we have 3 poll questions today. This is the first. If you are in the process of evaluating application migration options, which are the target platforms are you looking at? And I apologize, I messed this question up. You should be able to select multiple, but in this case you're going to select one. So select the one that you're most interested in. And wow, we already have 75% of us voting, so this is great. We appreciate your feedback, and I'm going to now share the results. So the most interesting one are SharePoint Online at 46%, SharePoint On-Premise 29%, Salesforce 4%, other 4%, and still analyzing 18%.
Okay, thanks, Scott. So good. At least, majority of you are considering SharePoint as the primary platform. And so what we discussed today, while we showcase it with respect to SharePoint Online, quite a bit of it also applies to SharePoint On-Prem, right? So you could take away some of these inputs for your SharePoint On-Prem as well. So we talked about focusing on workflow applications. And why is it that we are focusing on workflow applications? It's because one of the things that happens, especially in the Notes platform, is it's been used to build fairly complex workflows to kind of have fairly integrations with email and notifications, and you have these agents that kind of run in and do all kinds of jobs for you. So it's been And quite often people find that these kind of workflow applications they kind of worry about when you're moving into the SharePoint platform. Things like content management or say a task management or even like just a site that kind of collates documents and puts it together with metadata. More often than not, yes, they do need some customization, but there are targets in SharePoint that when well customized and when well set up moves pretty nicely. Like yes, you might have to do data migration carefully, then you might have to test it properly and then verify your search works and things like that. But the key thing is when it comes to complex workflow applications, there's always this fear, will my application work in SharePoint and how will it work in SharePoint and what do I do with it? So that's the reason we focus on the workflow applications today. So let's look at how do you build workflows in SharePoint or anyway? I mean, is there something default? How do we start off with it? So there are multiple ways, like any enterprise platform, there's not just a single option. You have multiple ways to build workflow applications in SharePoint. Let's just discuss a few of them. One is the out-of-the-box workflow, right? It's called, earlier there were especially for those on-prem SharePoint users, there was the entire SharePoint designer workflows, designer 2013, and then it just kind of carried over to 2016. On SharePoint Online, you have something called the SharePoint out-of-the-box workflows. It's easy. Most of it is configuration. But if you go into complex applications, if you have, in a same workflow, let's say there's a part which is serial, and then you have another part which is parallel, and then you have rejections, questions that go back and things like that. When you kind of inherit such complex workflows, you can still do it with SharePoint out of the box, but then it just starts involving more coding and more maintenance and things like that. So recently, Microsoft previewed something called Flow. Now, Flow is an add-on product, and it kind of makes it very easy for business-level users to build workflows. Again, simple stuff like, for example, hey, I have this document. I want it to move into a new status after approval. And the approval, there's two levels of approval. There's one reject. That's about it. Stuff like this can be built pretty easily in Flow. In fact, such applications can be built by business users themselves. You don't need development skills. But the thing is, this entire thing as of now is a little bit more user-driven, and it's almost like that IFTTT. So it's like, if then, what should be done kind of a thing. That kind of workflows is what this caters to. The third option, which is obviously the most powerful because you have complete control over what you can do and what you cannot do, is using the Visual Studio's workflow. Now, obviously it's complex because think of a lot of coding, but again, it gives you complete control. Once you cross over the steep learning curve, then you can really do magic with it. You could kind of integrate with Azure apps, or you could do, complex integrations with line of business applications and things like that. Basically, you can do anything at all with it. But then you also have third-party tools. And we've just listed a couple of them which are fairly popular, and you might have heard of them, in your conversations and things like that. One is called Nintex, and the other one is called K2. Both of them have been around for quite some time. They have SharePoint on-prem products as well, and they also have the online version of it. So primarily today, we are going to focus on Nintex. Both of them are very good products, but they cater to different markets. We will talk about it in the next couple of slides. But today's focus, again, because we wanted to give a flavor of how this entire thing is going to work, is on Nintex as a third-party workflow platform. Okay, so how do I get Nintex? And if I want to try it out and things like that, on your SharePoint Online, there is something called a SharePoint store, and then you can search for Nintex, and then you get the results. As you can see, it's called Nintex Workflow for Office 365. You could add it into your SharePoint instance, into your tenant, and you do get I think there is a trial version for about a month. So you could, even today, go back and play around with it. So that we wanted to leave you. Similarly, K2 also has it's an app that is available as an add-in. Now you can search for it and then add it to your SharePoint tenant. Typically, if you are in a production environment, if you have controls, your global administrators may not allow you to add in. So what we suggest is you can set yourself up with a sample developer tenant from Microsoft and use this and try things out. Okay, so how does this kind of work? As I said, our focus a little bit more is on Nintex. It's like a externalized workflow engine, right? And the workflow manager itself, so even within the SharePoint tenant in Office 365, when you run your workflows and even when you build your SharePoint out of the workflows, what happens is you are sharing the workflow manager with the overall tenancy. So there are limits. There are it takes a little bit of time for the workflow manager to kick in and do things for you. But overall, it's kind of, the architecture is very similar to how it was with the on-prem. So you could build your workflows using different tools, and then you have the SharePoint object model, and then that connects with your workflow manager using REST calls. So that's how it works. And Nintex literally, it's built on top. It gives you a visual way to configure your workflows. It's kind of easy to use, and especially when it starts looking at complex workflows, you have the ability to kind of reuse them. You can copy existing workflows. You can assign the same workflows to multiple items and things like that. So these are some add-on functionality that this particular third-party product brings on board. One key thing is if you look at the K2, which is a fairly complete product in itself as well. Now what happens is that's a BPM suite. So one of the reasons, what we have seen in our experience is organizations that are large enough and who are looking at a complete BPM suite on top of the Microsoft platform definitely look at K2 because it kind of gives a complete experience on that. So you have independent, you can work with Visio as a workflow designer, you could work with Visual Studio. There's a lot of options. And obviously, when it's a complete BPM suite, it's a lot more expensive compared to other third-party products, right? Again, in our experience, when we look at organizations, especially looking for migration from Lotus into SharePoint, if they have a lot of applications and with I wouldn't call it very complex workflows, but what we typically see as standard stuff, we find them going in for Nintex because it's an intermediate point. That's what we have seen, that it's intermediate between just relying on the SharePoint workflows and not investing in something like K2. But we have seen organizations that invest in K2 as well. Okay, so before we jump into the actual demo, how do you go about doing the application migration? Let's touch upon a little bit on the methodology of this entire migration program. So, Scott, can you just run poll 2?
Okay, we have our second poll up on the screen. So please select the one that's most important to you. So what are the most important business goals for your migration program? Is it connected integration work environment, or modern and easy to use applications, or the ability to quickly add features and applications leveraging modern technology? So again, which one is most important to you? All right, we're at 75% voted. Come on, more people like this question. All right, so we're almost reaching 90%. This is pretty good. Thank you for your participation. Let me share the results. So 24% believe that a connected integrated work environment is the most important. Modern and easy to use applications is the most popular, 47. And the ability to quickly add features and applications is 29%.
Thanks, Scott. I know it's a trick question, right? I mean, most of you probably wanted to answer all three. But yeah, what we see is quite often there is this need. Some of the old applications and notes can look pretty clunky, and then so anything is better off than having to work with that. That is definitely an answer that we keep hearing. And of course, the reason quite often people go in for SharePoint Online is the ability to be able to, focus on this cloud. The cloud movement is, of course, very big across the industry and multiple industries. And so being on the cloud, being able to leverage the fact that you can still build applications and you use SharePoint Online, that prompts quite a few organizations to pick SharePoint Online specifically for their applications. So I talked about methodology, right? And obviously the very first step was analysis, and I don't know how many of you attended our previous webinar where we kind of discussed a lot about it. So today I'm just going to take a minute to say it's absolutely critical to right size the scope, because the scope determines how much budget and how much cost is this entire program going to be. And we did discuss in that in the last webinar how this is not just a simple project, but it's an overarching program, because at the end of it, typically people want to decommission their notes infrastructure. So yeah, you could go in and take a look at the webinar and the slide deck. So we will not focus on analysis. Let's jump to the next step. So my assumption is at the end of it, you have a scope defined, which says, okay, this is how I have my most important applications clustered. I have my departments, and then also the most used, and you have defined what applications have to be just archived. Some of them have to be migrated. Some of them are just going to be left alone on the notes platform to kind of be phased out over a period of time. So we discussed all that. So after this, where do I start? So the life cycle of the overall migration program, if you look at it, begins with governance. And I'll talk about why it is important. Is this migration never happens as one application at a time. It's usually a set of waves or clusters. You identify similar applications. It could be based on the templates. It could be based on the department level applications. It could be in many different ways, and there are options to look at them, but it usually is done as a wave. And before you start off, you need governance processes for SharePoint, and especially when it comes to SharePoint Online, what we've seen in our customers is there is a global administration group that kind of controls accesses and how you can use SharePoint and things like that. And then you also have the specific SharePoint groups, governance groups, that determine how you're going to set up specific standards and taxonomies, keywords through the organization, right? Now you don't want, let me put it very simply, you don't want to have, let's say you have a office locations as one of the areas. Now you have to standardize it. You don't want each application to go create their own office locations, creating a maintenance nightmare down the line. This is just one example. There are many areas inclusive of security, access control lists, what is authorization and permissions. How do you define overall keywords? And also you may have to have governance mechanisms to determine how you're going to let people add keywords. One of the key things in SharePoint is the entire enterprise search, where the search becomes more and more useful as the keyword list starts getting built up, and many of these gets determined at the governance. And the other aspect is the governance is an ongoing process. It's not as if I just start off a team that's typically it does contain, the governance committee does have people from the IS or the IT department. It has people from the business side, and together this is kind of aligned with the business needs. And this kind of continues on through the program, because there may be needs that are coming up and there needs to be response to it. The second team, and then a second activity that is also a fairly it goes on for some time, is the entire business analysis and application migration. So typically there is a layer, especially large organizations, but even smaller organizations need to have a layer between the pure IT migration teams, as I would call it, and the end users. Remember, there definitely, most often than not, it's a slightly conflicting goal, right, between what the business needs and what the IT wants to complete. And we'll come to that. The thing is, this business team will kind of right-size the individual application scope, because you don't want the end users to come back and ask you for everything. And I'll take an example. Not all applications are ready to be mobile enabled when they come to SharePoint. Maybe some basic levels, but then your end user can come back and ask, I want something that's similar to a native iOS application. Where's the budget? It shouldn't be part of your application migration. It should be part of an enhancement request or something like a modernization of this application, right? So this business team does two specific things. It kind of works with the business analysts, work with the business to right-size the application scope, and they also work to ensure that what is delivered by the migration team kind of fits exactly. So they kind of become enablers of the UAT. They kind of ensure that training is conducted, and it kind of becomes, the migration aspect becomes very smooth. The third is what I call as a migration factory, really, right? As I said, typically it's not a single application, unless there is a one application that's so huge and it's extremely complex that it's completely takes up a small team by itself. Usually the migrations are conducted as a factory. And why do I say this? Because there are several steps, and as we work on one step, another person can work on another step, and then there can be some amount of overlaps and things like that, thus crunching the timeline. So typically it's a process and tool-based migration people are talking about, and always best practices are shared between the teams, right? You don't want to reinvent the wheel with each application. You don't want, if there's a standardized way. For example, let's take attachment handling. You want all your applications to do attachment handling in the same consistent way. You don't want them, each one, to pick its own way. So which is why it goes in together as factory. And as applications get migrated, then they need to go through a quick UAT and rollout. And I think in the last webinar, we talked about simple, medium, complex applications, how long they take in terms of business needs. So one of the key things here is very quickly get UAT done, very quickly enable the users to specific things. I mean, more or less the applications will be easy enough to use in SharePoint, but then you also want to add that little bit where they use the SharePoint best practices, so that they can benefit the most of SharePoint. And finally, when all these are done, at some point in time, the decommissioning part starts off, and it goes as a parallel activity until the overall nodes infrastructure gets decommissioned. So it's a kind of a program life cycle. So within the program life cycle, then obviously individual apps go through their own life cycle. It's a sub life cycle, so to speak, within the overall program. So how do we do that? One of the things that we found is starting off with a subset of data migration is what we call it. Typically it's tool-based. You take and we've seen organizations pick, there are other tools, but by far the most popular that we've seen and we work with is the Quest tool or the binary tree tool. So you start off, and one of the key things the business analysts work with business is to identify what is the scope of data migration, right? Not every application needs to migrate every single thing. You might want a subset. You may, for example, you can say, I only want my open request to come through. All my closed requests can just be archived. Some cases, I want data for the last 2 years because there's a mandatory need. I need that for analysis, whatever it is. So you set up the appropriate data migration parameters. You have to configure the Quest tool. You have to set it up correctly, do a migration, and do a partial migration. You don't need to do the entire migration, but enough for you to be able to develop on top of it to give the end users a clear flavor of what's going to come. On top of that, when the data migration is done, typically like now your lists are created, and you have certain content types created. What needs to be done on top of that is actually designing the form. What is it that the end users are going to see? And only a basic default form will come, and most people don't like that. So there is amount of customization in terms of the UI aspects of it and the kind of views that we want. And here, there are some best practices we'll talk about. On top of it, then the actual workflow design takes place, right? And this is where in today's discussion, we are going to look at how Nintex makes it easier and how you could design your workflow with Nintex. And then there is a quick test cycle, right? Now, what we do here is to kind of take the application, apart from the standard unit tests and things like that. So you have a checkpoint with a customer. So it's really a checkpoint. It's driven by the business analyst. They talk to the business users and say, hey, look, here's the data, partial data that's migrated. This is how it's going to look. This is what's going to happen in the workflow. And if there are minor modifications that they suggest, and typically we've seen this come up, as we talked about it, sometimes there may be small little features that are so critical for the end user, and if that doesn't get migrated, or if you don't incorporate it in SharePoint, they may not go in with a UAT success. So it's important to have this intermediate checkpoint to kind of validate with the business that this is in line with what their expectations are. They could use it. Then once they say yes, it's okay, then you migrate the entire data, move the functionality into the site that we want, run the verification and validation, typically done by the business analyst, to reduce the end business involvement, make sure everything is working, get a UAT, get an enablement, and sign off. And this goes off in a cycle. And the reason I also talked about the migration factory is because there is a back and forth, there may be some time gaps in between. And if you have a wave of applications migrated, then your migration team, which is actually doing the data migration or building the workflow, while the business analysts are getting time with the business users, validating stuff and things like that, these days can go on to the next application. And it kind of flows almost like a line, right? Almost like a manufacturing line. It just goes on to the different stages, and then you can manage the entire factory in that manner. Okay, so what we are going to do today, this is just giving you an overview of the overall migration program, and then we talked about what is the specifics internally to an application. Now, Rekha will take you through a simple application, but which does have some workflow elements into it. So this is a resource request, and I'm sure a variation of this exists in most organizations. It's a legacy application in Notes. It has multi-level security and things like that. It does have several complex workflows. Now, we will take up but just one process with one set of workflow. We will show you how it got migrated, what are the key steps when it gets done in Nintex, and then we talk a little bit more about the best practices. So, Scott, if you can switch over to Rekha so that she can share the screen and walk us through the demo.
Hey, hi all, this is Rekha. So I'm going to take you to a small demo of resource request application. So the application that you're seeing in your current screen is built on Lotus Notes web. So I'm just showing the list of documents, records that are available in the database. So the data is whatever that you're seeing, all like test data, just for your quick view. I'm just switching another view just to show a different set of records. So this is all about the application. So let me take you to a new request of it. So the basic notes form, which has some fields over it, and what are that fields. So I'm not going to demonstrate it on the notes application. So I'm just going to take you to the Nintex part. So after we migrated the data from Notes to SharePoint through Quest, through any tool basically, so through Quest or binary tree. So after we got the data in SharePoint, we can have a default view actually. So but for now we have like customized to the default view, and it looks like the one that you are currently seeing in the screen. So I'm going to create a new request and show how the workflow, a simple workflow that's happening using Nintex. I'm going to create a new request. So this is a new request. So I'm just filling some mandatory fields. So the requester name is Daniel, so it's automatically popped up here. So it's taking the current date. So I'm just selecting an expected end date here. So these are some numbers that I'm filling in just for the demo purpose. So if you want to add any attachment, you can add it. So I'm just going to submit the form. Sometimes with SharePoint Online takes time, right? Yeah. So it just got submitted. So whatever the request that you got submitted, so it will be created as a task, and it will be available for the other user who is the approver of this workflow named Peter. So I'm just going to refresh just to see if the task has been come to Peter. Let me wait for some time. So I just edited. So this is the default form that you're seeing in Nintex. So if you don't like this UI, you can customize the same form. So, but we have just, in the interest of demo, we just taken the default form just to show you how the look and feel of it. So you can approve or reject, or you can mark your comments here. So I'm just going to approve it. Yeah. So I just showed you a simple workflow, how it's happening in Nintex. So let's see how this workflow got built up in the backend. So I have an admin user called Philip. So I just logged in that user already. So this is what the workflow that you have just seen, how dynamically you can build that workflow here. So I'm just assigned a task initially by submitting a request to Peter. So Peter can approve or reject, and some of the list items will get updated, something like status or date, something like that, and the workflow gets completed. So this is a simple workflow. So by copying the same workflow, like we can reuse this workflow and we can add so many tasks in between. So just I wanted to show you like how this is a complete workflow for the entire resource request application that we have already done. So if you can see, so this is like updating some list items and send an email later, and then you can start some other workflow from that, and it has like based upon the status and based upon the approvers, the workflows are getting splitted, and it goes on again and again. So the reusable of workflow, you can see it here. So I just wanted to show how to just build a workflow, how this is very easy to build a workflow. So I'm going to like assign a task. So when I assign a task, is automatically say approve or reject. So once it is done, I just want to send an email. So like I can send like once rejected, you can need to send an email. So just to show a sample how easily you can build this workflow. Yeah. So that's how it's very easy in Nintex to build a workflow which has multiple options. So you can see what are the items that you can add to this workflow. We can have a lot of things like check in and check out, copying a document. So what are the steps that you want to do like in between workflows when you go for a complex, when you think like it's a complex application? So these many actions that you can include in your regular workflows.
So one of the key things to note here is, there is no way the Lotus Notes workflow is going to transfer, right? There are no migration tools that's going to bring your actual workflow code and make it automatically in SharePoint. So one of the key things is to how quickly can I understand what was the original workflow, and we talked about it in our last webinar where we said, hey, make sure that you write that particular functional spec, right, which kind of gives you the input into creating this workflow. So someone who's accomplished with the workflow tool can very quickly put together, based on the functional spec, the kind of workflow diagram that goes with the list item. So you will get the data, you will get the list, and you will get part of the security also built in. The only thing that you need to construct and develop is going to be actually two things. One is the actual workflow, which also includes things like agents. So there is when you have agents and nodes that are doing certain scheduled activities, you need to write your timer jobs in SharePoint. They are easy to construct, but you need to create them. The second one is also the UI. As Rekha put it, the default form is very simple. Like it looks neat enough, but then if you want a customized UI, you could bring in aspects of you can completely customize it with respect to using JavaScript frameworks or Bootstrap and things like that. That is possible. Now, when you come into Nintex, the key thing to note is the ability to construct one standard workflow, and this is where making it into a wave works, is because let's assume there is a set of applications, HR applications. Now, for all of them, let's take an example of anytime I want to modify my personal information, I have to go through, and whatever be the personal information I modify, I need to get an approval from my immediate manager, then it goes to a line manager, and then it gets sent to HR, let's say. And this kind of, typically in Notes applications, this kind of functionality repeats. You may have, an application where you are tracking leave. In another application, maybe you're tracking travel requests. Yeah, ultimately, but they're going to be ending up with different list items, different data, but going through the similar workflow process. So what can be done is to construct a standardized workflow and associate the standard workflow with multiple items. So it is possible to do something like that, and you can copy the workflows and you can associate it with list items. And when you do that, when you have a change in your workflows, then you don't have to necessarily go in and modify every time. So obviously that's part of the reusability that's built in. So the other aspect in terms of building the Nintex workflows for the overall applications when you're doing the migration, some of the key best practices we have seen are, Scott, can you just switch over to me because I'm showcasing some of the best practices? Okay, so there are some do's and don'ts, right? What we have seen is it takes a little bit of time to work together and plan out your taxonomy, your keywords, and your master list ahead of time. Why? Because that can save significant amount of headaches in terms of maintainability of applications, and can also save a lot of frustration down the line when different applications need to use similar kind of data. It becomes much easier when you plan this ahead of time. There is this aspect of what's called site templates in SharePoint. So when you are migrating applications, it's important to pick the right site template. And I'll explain what I mean by this. There are applications and notes which are primarily starting off from documents and go through workflows, right? So they are. It could be like let's say approval of a proposal. Now you build a proposal, that proposal is a document, and then there is a complete workflow associated with it. Now in such cases, even when you're building up your new application, start planning it out and using the right content template, which is based off a document library, automatically gives you an edge, because documents, when you have a document library in SharePoint, it automatically qualifies for enterprise search, and a few things happen on top of it. Whereas when you say it's predominantly a list kind of a thing. It's a set of fields, let's say a travel request. All that I'm interested in is going to be the start date, the end date, where am I going, and things like that. Then it makes sense not to use a document library, because the attachments in there are just incidental to it. You're not particularly keen on searching on that. You're just looking at approving this request and moving on with it. So it's important to differentiate and define the target types. And as part of what we discussed in the migration program, what we have seen people do is to kind of define it ahead of time to a certain extent. I'm not saying everything gets defined, but definitely between the business analyst and the SharePoint architects, they kind of define, okay, if this is the kind of functionality that the original Notes application has, this is where it should go and this is how it should be built. The next one is using the appropriate content type goes along with it, making sure how this works together. Some of the times, and we've seen some very complex applications where you have a lot of master lists that are all interconnected with each other, right? Based on one value, another value gets picked up, and then you need to make sure that these interconnected fields transfer over correctly. This is an important part of the data migration process. When you look at the tool, it needs to be configured right, and from that it can move over. So it's important to understand the relationship between the fields, how they are supposed to be, and then move them over appropriately. And the key thing from a don't perspective is do not try to mimic a notes feature identically, because SharePoint is a different platform. It has its very good strength. It has modern look and feel. It has it is easy to use quite often. So what is needed is just to help the users bridge the gap. You don't need extraordinary amounts of training, but at the same time, you don't want it to exactly mimic your Notes applications, because then you're left with the same kind of functionality or the same kind of issues that might have happened in the Notes side. The number of columns, and this goes I mean, this is true in notes as well. If you had added indiscriminately, if you added number of columns, and if you added sort on top of the columns or filters on top of the columns, believe me, like even in the notes application platform, we could live with fairly slow notes client applications. Some of it transfers over to SharePoint. If you add columns indiscriminately, there are problems. So it helps to look at what really needs to transfer over and then bring in, for example, filters that kind of help even with the same set of views, but bring in rich functionality on top of it. It is important, again, one of the key tasks when the business analyst and the migration team work together is to also identify, and most of you know, the notes applications are built over a period of time. It may have redundant fields that don't necessarily mean anything. And also, you may have a lot of fields that were added on top of it primarily for audit trail purposes and things like that. Some of it, when it comes to SharePoint, it may not be needed. So it is important to watch out and do not add too many fields to lists. And it's also best practice to kind of split up lists and appropriately bring them together when you're building your workflows. Definitely, this is important. And again, it's not new. We have most well-developed applications in Notes also started following these. You cannot add individual names to your ACLs. That's not going to be a best practice. Similarly, when you bring it down to SharePoint Online, specifically, look at your AD groups for permissions. Appropriately set those up so that it is easy enough to add and remove permissions to applications centrally as opposed to adding individual users, which is not a good idea at all. Now, one of the key things when you're migrating is if your readers and authors fields actually ended up having user names. So there needs to be in a kind of a data, when you do the data migration, it may be necessary to look at how we will handle these and appropriately handle it during the data migration process. Some challenges that we've seen quite often. When you're migrating, how do you ensure that the data is clean? You don't end up getting bad data. How do you ensure that there's no data loss? And also with respect to parent-child relationships and things like that, how do you ensure that the relationship is maintained? So this topic, you need to work on the tool that you use and plan it ahead of time and make sure that the rules are set up properly in the tool that you use that automatically helps during your data migration. There is need for a data validation step. So it is important to validate the data that has come in, and especially with respect to things like relationships between fields, with respect to parent-child relationship between records, it is important to do a data validation step before proceeding with the actual design and development. There is no point in developing the entire application and then figuring out there are issues with your fundamental data or your list. The second aspect that we've seen is hidden computation, and this is very typical of Notes applications. You may have a set of hidden fields. They're all calculating data based on which some views are getting updated or they are being used in agents and things like that. So it's important. The data will transfer, but how are you going to bring back the same functionality in Notes? Sometimes they are relevant in terms of building your workflows and things like that. Sometimes they are not. Or they are just used for notifications or reporting. It's important to look at that kind of computations and ensure how you're going to transfer it over to SharePoint. This takes a little bit of design effort before the actual development. Attachments is a key area. It usually is helpful if you define how you're going to handle attachments in an overall basis. If not for the entire organization, at least within the work group and things like that, define it so that all applications will be consistent in the way, they handle attachments. And again, your Notes itself may be inconsistent, right? You may have individual documents for attachments, and then just the document UNID is referenced. In some other cases, attachments may be in the Notes documents itself. It helps to plan this out, and then when you do the data migration, appropriately handle it. The last one is the security aspect. I did touch upon it by talking about the readers and authors field. If you have individual names there, it helps to prepare a data map which says, okay, these kind of individual names, what should be the appropriate AD group that gets access and things like that. And the key is, if you really want to give access to only that particular individual, this is where the business analyst and the IT team come into play based on the functional spec. So if it is very clear that, yes, I want individual records to be accessed only by individual people, and some applications have that constraint, then you need to bring it over also and continue to use the same kind of security model in the SharePoint application as well. So Scott, let's do a quick third poll.
Okay, the third poll and final poll is on your screen. So which of these IT goals is the most important for your migration program? Is it fast rollout? Is it minimize business disruption, business team involvement? Or is cost the most important goal? All right, already 70% of us have voted. 80%. Give us 2 more seconds here, and I'll share the results. So it looks like fast rollout is 21% of the audience believes that's the most important. 74% believe minimizing business disruption and or business team involvement, and then 6% are very cost sensitive. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Scott. This is, I think, expected. See, the biggest challenge for IT teams is to kind of make this migration a success, at the same time not allow the business to be either disrupted or making sure, like, that they get what they want with the minimum time that they will allocate for that. So which is why in the entire program, we did devise this aspect of a business analyst in between, right? It is important for someone who understands the business needs to kind of work closely with the migration factory, so that you could eliminate 80 to 90%, or 80% at least, of some of the issues that could potentially come. And when you take it to the users, they only spend minimum amount of time in the UAT. And they just get quickly enabled on the new application platform. So that's something that we've seen as one of the best practices, to involve this kind of intermediary team that works closely with business, and that kind of helps minimize this disruption. The second thing from our experience we've seen is also that intermediary checkpoint, as we call it. Instead of waiting for the entire application to be completed with all the workflows, all the form designs and everything like that, it helps to have an intermediary checkpoint where it's not completely built, but enough is built. It's like basically the data has been migrated, so they can see what is their original data in the new application. The form has been partially built so that they can see how it's likely to look and feel, and then they can actually look at parts of the workflow to see that, yes, not the entire workflow, but like what Rekha showed you, just a very simple part of the workflow, so that you can catch issues ahead of time, especially with respect to UI, with respect to the usability of the application. You can catch it ahead of time and not wait until the end. So with that, we open up for questions. Before that, from just a 1-minute plug on what Maarga has been doing. We've been working with multiple partners and our own internal tool sets, and also building these migration factories and teams that can work with customers to help migration. Okay. Scott, before we open for questions, some of the new webinars that are coming up, and you can please subscribe to them, what will be relevant for you guys.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, so we do have some questions in the queue ready for you. This one's specific to the application you were showing in the demo. Is this a custom app? or is it based on a template?
No, this was a custom app. It's a specific custom application for the customer.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I think they just wanted to just double check that with some follow-up questions. So the next question is how do they capture a list of approvers? Or is there a way to import it, maybe?
Yeah. So there is a possibility to, this particular app in Notes also had a list of approvers as a master list. We've seen both. Sometimes it comes in the list of approvers is either a role or a group. When it brings it into SharePoint, now typically it is configured as an AD group, and then you use the AD group to give appropriate permissions as well as list them in, if at all needed, into a person kind of a field from which it can be taken up. In this particular application, it was just a master list of approvers, so the master list was also brought over into SharePoint.
Okay, brilliant. And is there a way to reassign a task?
Yeah. Yes, you can reassign a task. So when you build the workflow, you can add that particular item there and you can mark, like, if you want to reassign, there will be an action provided and the workflow will drive you to, reassigning the task to the designated person.
Okay.
Yeah, that's possible.
Excellent, excellent. And can we add custom scripts to the Nintex forms?
Okay. Yeah. Scott, if you can, change the presentation rise to me so that I can show my screen.
Okay.
Just to answer. Yeah. Okay. So I just opened a form, like the resource request form, which we show you, the customized form. So if I want to add some scripts, customized scripts. So in a Nintex form, I have some form settings. So where I can, add some customized CSS and customized JavaScript code. So this way we can add some of the customized scripts.
Yeah, and as we said earlier, typically, pretty much all JavaScript frameworks are supported. So you could have, functionality built using AngularJS or Knockout.js and things like that, and it can get integrated. It takes a little more time and effort to bring in such functionality also. Some people, and we've seen customers who just say, no, just leave it be with just the basic default look and feel. It's neat enough and modern enough, and we don't really want to customize it with a lot of jazz. There are customers who say, no, we would like to have a fairly deep customization of the look and feel so that it kind of brings in the modernity that they seek. Both are possible, and both have been seen.
Okay, brilliant. And along the lines of a previous question about capturing a list of approvers, are there ways to import keyword, like keyword master lists? Or is that part of the data migration or the data exporting, importing?
Yes. So there are two, I'll split it into two parts, right? One is to bring in the lists that are already there. Now, it's there in the Notes application. They are like keyword lists and things like that. There's a view, and then you bring it over one time. That's part of the data migration. But we have also seen applications where on an ongoing application maintenance task, right, what happens is there will be an application owner or an administrator, and what they do is to just import lists from, say, an Excel sheet or a CSV file to update the keyword list. Such stuff also happen, and you can see this quite often in Notes, right? They would export a list, they will just make some modifications, and then they re-import it back and things like that. Now, when you have to have such functionality, depending upon the complexity of the import or the export, you may have to write custom scripts, either in C#, and then run those custom scripts, make UI modifications so that when they click on import, they get a custom script that runs and allows them to import the data. This is typically for maintenance of the application on an ongoing basis.
Okay, brilliant. does Nintex support HTML5 tags?
Yeah, I mean, yes. So you do have ability to support CSS3 and HTML5. The Nintex forms itself, and it constantly keeps evolving. That's what I've seen, and what they support. Again, because you are in the online platform, you can expect newer features to keep being added, and it gets current because you are on the online platform, unlike the on-prem where upgrades are very specific.
Okay, brilliant. And then we have 3 more questions lined up. And thank you, Allison, for these questions, all from the same attendee. So what is the best data migration tool in your opinion? Trick question.
Okay. Trick question. Okay, let me put it this way. Instead of like not just saying the best rated, we've seen the most success with both binary tree and Quest. So I would say, by and large, these two are the most popular.
Okay. All right. Once you migrate the data, where can you check it in SharePoint?
Okay, so typically when you start the data migration process, you create the target area in SharePoint. So you create a site, and then when you move the data, you can go into the site and then be able to see it in either like the all items list or standard views, the default views that are there. You can see where it is and how things are. Typically, for data validation purposes, what we do is write some PowerShell scripts that kind of automate this. I mean, checking manually may not work all the time. It's useful to just do a quick check, but to do a real data validation, typically scripts are written that kind of run on this data and then give you reports to say how well the data migration has happened.
Okay, perfect. And we'll make this our last question because we are just a couple of minutes over time. But the last question is, do lists have to be created before migration or after?
Okay, so again, it depends. Most often, like, you have the scripts create the list. So when you do the data migration, if you configure it right, then the list gets created. And then all you do is modify them to the way you want. And then also if you want to make some changes with respect to the types and the data types, or if you want to associate certain content types that are predefined, those are the things that you typically do. And then of course the workflow you associate with the entire, typically again, in our experience, we associate it with a content type, not specific to the list, but there are multiple ways of doing that.
Okay, brilliant. Do you have time for one more question?
Okay, sure.
Okay. How do you map rich text fields from notes forms to a SharePoint list field in case we need to migrate, let's see, in case we need to migrate rich text data to SharePoint lists? I'm not sure if that's even possible.
Okay. Yeah, so again, there is something called rich text in SharePoint as well. But again, the question is, what do you really want to migrate out of the rich text field? Quite often, and we've seen this happen in a couple of our customers, they've just said, okay, take this rich text data, convert it off, like, whatever is there as is with the formatting, just make it off into a PDF file and attach it into the SharePoint side, because it's not as if we are going to do anything with respect to inside SharePoint. We're not really going to do anything with respect to the rich text. We just need the data in. So we've seen something like that.
Okay, perfect. All right, we are well over time. I think there's 2 more questions that have come in, but we will answer those offline, and then in the email notification of where to go see the webinar replay, we will answer those questions there. And so I wanted to thank Rekha and Gayatri for this webinar. Very informative, and hopefully this gives everyone a good idea of some options that you have to get your notes databases over to SharePoint, and how, what is possible. So Gayatri, I will turn the time over to you. Can we switch back, I guess, to your screen? And I believe, is there a last slide that you share with your contact information, or is that the first one? You've got it right there, the sales and your email address. So Gayatri, I'll give you the last word, and then we'll end the webinar.
Okay. Thanks, Scott, and thank you everyone for attending. Feel free to reach out with other questions that you may have. You can write to either sales@maargasystems.com or gayatri@maargasystems.com. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Gayatri.